When grief looked like guilt, Stephanie Crowe, Michael Crowe. Chronicles of Clues. In the morning of January 21, 1998, a 14-year-old boy walked into his sister's bedroom. What he saw would follow him for the rest of his life. 12-year-old Stephanie Crowe had been stabbed to death in her own home in Escondido, California. There were no signs of forced entry, no broken windows, no kicked-in doors, no obvious intrusion, which meant one thing: whoever killed her may have already been inside. And from the very first hour, suspicion did not travel far. It traveled down the hallway. Stephanie's parents had been asleep. Her older brother, Michael Crowe, had been home that night. He was the one who discovered her body the next morning. When police arrived, they immediately began assessing not just the crime scene, but the behavior. And that's where this story begins to twist. Because Michael didn't cry the way investigators expected. He didn't collapse. He didn't appear hysterical. He was quiet, reserved, controlled. To some officers, that silence felt unnatural. To them, grief had a script, and Michael wasn't following it. That perception would change everything. The crime scene itself was disturbing. Stephanie had been attacked in her bed. The violence was shocking, especially given her age. Yet there were no clear signs that someone had broken in. No obvious forced entry. And in investigations like this, proximity becomes a powerful lens. Statistically, when violence happens inside a home, it is often committed by someone known to the victim. Sometimes a family member. Sometimes someone trusted. That statistical reality shaped the investigation from the very beginning. And once a theory begins to form, confirmation can follow quickly, even when it shouldn't. Michael Crowe was brought in for questioning. At first, he was treated as a witness. But the tone shifted rapidly. Detectives began pressing him harder. They pointed out what they described as inconsistencies. They told him his behavior was strange. They said his lack of visible emotion was suspicious. And then they did something that would later be heavily scrutinized. They began suggesting scenarios. They told him they already knew what happened. They implied they had evidence. They said honesty would help him. Michael was 14 years old. He had just found his sister murdered. He was separated from his parents. And he was being told by authority figures that they knew he was responsible. Hour after hour, the questioning continued. And slowly, confusion set in. Here's where the first major twist unfolds. At one point during interrogation, Michael began speculating. He said maybe he had blacked out. Maybe he had done something he couldn't remember. Maybe he was capable of something he didn't understand. That speculation, born from pressure and suggestion, became the foundation of what investigators called a confession. But it wasn't a clear admission. It was fragmented, inconsistent, at times contradictory. Yet the word confession carries enormous weight. Once it enters the narrative, it changes everything. Michael was arrested and charged with his sister's murder. The community was stunned. A teenage boy accused of killing his own sibling. The story was shocking. It made headlines. But it wasn't over, because investigators believed Michael hadn't acted alone. Two of Michael's friends, teenagers themselves, were also brought in. They were questioned for hours. They too began offering confused, pressured statements. One of them would later describe feeling as if detectives were writing the story for him. Details didn't line up. Timelines shifted. Physical evidence was lacking. But investigators believed they had uncovered a teenage conspiracy. 3 boys. A family tragedy. A case that seemed horrifying, but solved. Except it wasn't. Behind the scenes, cracks were forming. Forensic evidence from the scene did not support the confessions. There was no blood on Michael's clothing. No weapon tied to him. No fingerprints placing him inside his sister's bedroom during the attack. More troubling, some elements described in the confessions didn't match the physical realities of the crime scene. Experts who later reviewed the interrogations identified classic markers of false confession dynamics: lengthy questioning, isolation from parents, repeated suggestion, minimization techniques, promises of leniency. Juveniles are particularly vulnerable to these pressures. Their brains are still developing. Their impulse control is limited. Their desire to please authority figures is heightened. And under stress, they may begin to internalize narratives suggested to them, especially when those narratives are presented as fact. Then came another twist. A homeless man named Richard Tuite had been seen in the neighborhood around the time of the murder. He had reportedly approached Holmes. He had behaved erratically. Initially, he was questioned, but quickly dismissed. Why? Because investigators were already focused elsewhere. Once Michael became the central suspect, other possibilities faded into the background. But as doubts about the confessions grew, attention returned to Tuite. And this is where the case shifts direction. In 1999, the charges against Michael Crowe and his friends were dropped. The confessions were ruled unreliable. The prosecution acknowledged that the case could not move forward. Michael was released. But release is not the same as restoration. The accusation had already reshaped his life. His name had been tied to his sister's death. Public perception does not erase easily. And neither does trauma. Years later, Richard Tuite was brought back into focus. He was eventually charged and convicted of Stephanie Crowe's murder. The evidence against him was circumstantial but significant. He had been near the home. Fibers consistent with the Crowe household were found in his belongings. He had given inconsistent statements. The case, once again, appeared resolved. But the damage had already been done. So what really happened inside those interrogation rooms? Why did experienced investigators become convinced that a grieving 14-year-old was a killer? The answer may lie in something deeply human: expectation. When detectives first entered the Crowe home and found no forced entry, a silent assumption formed. It must have been someone inside. When Michael appeared calm, that assumption hardened. He doesn't look devastated. He doesn't look shocked enough. But here's the truth that often gets overlooked. Grief is not uniform. Some people cry immediately. Some go numb. Some detach emotionally as a protective mechanism. Especially teenagers. Especially boys raised to suppress visible emotion. But once Michael's quiet demeanor was interpreted as guilt, every subsequent action was filtered through that lens. That's called confirmation bias. We see what we expect to see. We hear what we expect to hear. And we dismiss what doesn't fit. There's another layer to this case that's harder to confront. Interrogation tactics used during the 1990s often relied on psychological pressure. Detectives were trained to confront suspects aggressively, to present false evidence, to imply inevitability. These techniques were designed to elicit confessions from guilty individuals. But they don't come with a built-in safeguard against the innocent. In Michael's case, investigators told him they had evidence linking him to the crime. They suggested his memory might be blocked. They offered hypothetical explanations that gradually became narrative. And at 14, under pressure, isolated from his parents, exhausted and confused, Michael began doubting himself. That doubt became vulnerability. That vulnerability became words. And those words were treated as fact. Imagine being told repeatedly by authority figures that you committed a crime. Imagine being told they already know. Imagine being told honesty will help you. Over time, resistance erodes. And in juveniles, it erodes faster. This case would later become one of the most cited examples of false confession among minors in the United States. It forced departments to reconsider how children are interrogated. It contributed to reforms requiring parental presence. It sparked conversations about recorded interrogations. But those reforms came after the damage. Here's the final twist. Even after charges were dropped, even after Tuite was convicted, some members of the public continued to question Michael's innocence. That's the lingering power of accusation. Once someone is publicly associated with violence, doubt lingers. Michael Crowe had to grow up carrying that shadow. He eventually pursued legal action against the city. Settlements were reached. But compensation does not restore a childhood spent under suspicion. It does not erase the memory of being handcuffed. It does not erase interrogation tapes that still exist. Stephanie Crowe's life was taken. Her family endured unimaginable loss. And instead of clarity, they endured years of confusion layered on top of grief. This case is not simply about a wrongful accusation. It's about perception, about how quickly suspicion can attach to behavior, about how emotional expectation can distort investigative objectivity. Because in the absence of forced entry, investigators looked inward. And when they looked inward, they interpreted grief as guilt. There's something deeply unsettling about that. Not because mistakes were made, but because the mistake was understandable. That's what makes it dangerous. It wasn't corruption. It wasn't malice. It was human bias under pressure. A community wanted answers. A family needed justice. Detectives believed they were protecting the public. But belief is not proof. And suspicion is not evidence. When the interrogation tapes were later analyzed, experts identified moments where detectives corrected Michael's version of events. They steered him away from inaccuracies. They guided him toward details that aligned with known facts. Over time, the narrative became more coherent, not because memory improved, but because direction was provided. And that distinction matters, because a confession built through suggestion is not the same as one born from guilt. So, what do we learn from this? That behavior is not forensic evidence. That silence is not admission. That grief has no universal language. And that the mind under pressure can generate false certainty, especially in youth, especially when authority insists. In 1998, many believed the case was solved. Then they believed it had been wrong. Then they believed it was resolved again. But the real story isn't about resolution. It's about recognition. Recognition that justice requires humility. Recognition that investigators are human. Recognition that assumptions can quietly shape outcomes. Stephanie Crowe deserves to be remembered. Not as a case study. Not as a headline. But as a young girl whose life mattered. And Michael Crowe's story serves as a reminder that in the search for truth, we must guard against the temptation to interpret emotion as evidence. Because sometimes the person who looks guilty is just grieving. This has been Chronicles of Clues, where the truth isn't always loud, but it's always there.